What if old Hollywood's perfect marriages were sometimes nothing more than carefully staged publicity? Behind glamorous premieres, smiling photographs, and studio-approved romances, some of cinema's biggest actresses became involved in relationships that could have destroyed careers overnight. Sometimes she was married, sometimes he was, and sometimes both were. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden side of classic Hollywood, subscribe to our channel now. Number 1. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Few movie sets created a scandal as explosive as Cleopatra. In 1962, Elizabeth Taylor arrived in Rome as one of the most famous women alive, but she was also married to singer Eddie Fisher. Richard Burton, playing Mark Antony opposite her Cleopatra, had a wife of his own, Sybil Burton. Somewhere between rehearsals, enormous sets, and endless production delays, their screen chemistry became something much more dangerous. The relationship quickly became impossible to hide. Photographers followed them through Rome, newspapers turned their every appearance into front-page material, and even the Vatican publicly criticized the romance. Taylor eventually divorced Fisher, while Burton's marriage also ended. What made the scandal unforgettable was that neither star quietly disappeared afterward. They married in 1964 and became perhaps Hollywood's most famous turbulent couple, separating, reconciling, divorcing, and even marrying each other twice. Their relationship wasn't simply gossip whispered behind studio gates, it became international spectacle. For Taylor, the affair changed her public image forever, from glamorous movie princess to a woman who openly refused to live according to Hollywood's carefully controlled rules. Number 2. Marilyn Monroe and Yves Montand. A romantic comedy was supposed to be the assignment, but Let's Make Love produced far more gossip off-camera than anyone expected. Marilyn Monroe was married to playwright Arthur Miller when she began working opposite French actor and singer Yves Montand. Montand, meanwhile, was married to acclaimed actress Simone Signoret. The two stars spent months filming together in 1960, and contemporary reports as well as later biographies described a relationship developing between them. Their spouses were not strangers either. Miller was involved with the production, while Signoret had initially socialized with Monroe. What followed became another chapter in Marilyn's complicated private life. Montand eventually returned to Signoret, and Monroe's marriage to Miller was already deteriorating badly. Unlike some later stories attached to Monroe, this particular relationship has been widely reported rather than existing only as decades-later conspiracy. Yet it also illustrates the strange reality of her fame. Almost every friendship became gossip, while genuine relationships could be hidden beneath even louder rumors. Before we continue, subscribe if you're enjoying this journey behind Hollywood's polished image. We're only 2 names in, and the secrets become even harder for the studios to hide from here. Number 3. Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini. America once treated her almost like the symbol of respectable womanhood, which made what happened next particularly explosive. After starring in Casablanca, Gaslight, and Notorious, Ingrid Bergman traveled to Italy to work with director Roberto Rossellini on Stromboli. Bergman was married to Petter Lindström, while Rossellini also had complicated marital ties. Their professional admiration became a relationship, and soon the story crossed from Hollywood gossip into an international moral controversy. Bergman left her husband, and the public reaction in the United States was astonishingly severe. A U.S. senator publicly condemned her, newspapers debated her character, and the actress who had once seemed untouchable suddenly found herself unwelcome in much of American entertainment. She eventually married Rossellini after divorcing Lindström and remained in Europe for years. When Bergman later returned triumphantly to Hollywood and won another Academy Award, the old scandal had lost much of its power. Her story remains perhaps the clearest example of how differently women and men could be judged during Hollywood's supposedly glamorous golden age. Number 4. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. For decades, one of Hollywood's most famous romances existed almost entirely outside the traditional rules of marriage. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy met while making Woman of the Year in 1941, beginning a partnership that eventually stretched across 9 films and more than 2 decades. There was one enormous complication. Tracy remained legally married to Louise Treadwell Tracy. He and his wife lived largely separate lives, but divorce never came. Hepburn therefore kept the relationship remarkably private, especially by modern celebrity standards. They avoided presenting themselves publicly as a conventional couple, and Hepburn reportedly adjusted her life around Tracy's circumstances. Their connection lasted until his death in 1967. Hepburn did not attend his funeral, reportedly out of respect for his family. Only later did she speak more openly about the relationship, helping transform what had once been a carefully protected Hollywood secret into one of cinema history's best-known love stories. Romantic as later generations sometimes portray it, however, its reality was considerably more complicated because Tracy's marriage legally remained in place. Number 5. Vivien Leigh and Peter Finch. By the time audiences saw Vivien Leigh as one of cinema's ultimate romantic heroines, her private relationships had already become far more complicated than any studio publicity department wanted to explain. Her marriage to Laurence Olivier was legendary, but during its increasingly difficult later years, Leigh became involved with Australian actor Peter Finch. The relationship became serious enough that Leigh reportedly considered leaving Olivier altogether. One remarkable account says Leigh and Finch actually arrived at Heathrow Airport intending to leave together, only for heavy fog to disrupt the plan. Whether fate truly changed Hollywood history that day is impossible to know, but the relationship itself became part of Leigh's documented biography. Her marriage to Olivier continued through years of intense personal strain, before ending in divorce in 1960. The irony is striking. Leigh and Olivier had themselves begun as lovers, while previous marriages complicated their lives, only for their own celebrated marriage to eventually be shaken by other relationships. Behind the image of Scarlett O'Hara stood a private life every bit as dramatic as her greatest roles. Number 6. Joan Crawford and Clark Gable. Long before celebrity relationships became instant news, MGM had enormous power to decide what audiences were allowed to know. That mattered when Joan Crawford and Clark Gable became romantically involved during the early 1930s. Both were major studio properties, and both had marriages complicating the situation. Their chemistry had been obvious in films such as Dance, Fools, Dance and Possessed. Behind the camera, however, their closeness reportedly became much more personal. For MGM executives, two married stars having an affair was exactly the sort of story capable of damaging carefully manufactured images. The relationship never became the lasting partnership some expected. Gable's romantic life remained famously complicated, while Crawford went through several marriages of her own. Still, later accounts, including major profiles of Gable, have described their relationship as an affair rather than simple studio gossip. It is a perfect example of how Golden Age Hollywood worked. Actors could create passionate romances on screen, while entire departments worked behind the scenes to make sure audiences never discovered when those feelings continued after the director called cut. Number 7. Ava Gardner and Frank Sinatra. One dinner, one attraction, and one of Hollywood's stormiest romances was underway. Ava Gardner and Frank Sinatra became intensely involved while Sinatra was still married to his first wife, Nancy Barbato Sinatra. The relationship quickly generated enormous publicity because both were already famous, but Sinatra's existing marriage made it especially controversial. Gardner later described their connection as passionate and volatile. Sinatra's career was going through a difficult period, while Gardner's fame was rising rapidly. Arguments and reconciliations became part of the mythology surrounding them. Nancy eventually granted Sinatra a divorce, and only days later, in 1951, he married Gardner. Marriage did not magically calm the relationship. Their powerful personalities repeatedly collided, and they separated before eventually divorcing in 1957. Yet neither completely erased the other from their life story. What began outside Sinatra's marriage became one of the defining relationships for both stars, proving again that the studios could manage publicity. But even Hollywood's most sophisticated image makers struggled to control two people determined to follow their emotions. Number 8. Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart. The famous whistle from To Have and Have Not was not the only thing attracting attention on that set. Lauren Bacall was just 20 when she met Humphrey Bogart, already one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Bogart was more than 2 decades older and married to actress Mayo Methot. What began between Bogart and Bacall during production became increasingly difficult to disguise. Bogart's marriage was already troubled, but it still existed legally, making his growing attachment to his young co-star a dangerous studio problem. Secret meetings and private correspondence became part of their early romance. Eventually, Bogart separated from Methot and secured a divorce. 11 days later, he married Bacall in May 1945. Unlike many relationships on this list, theirs survived the transition from forbidden Hollywood romance to marriage. They remained together until Bogart's death in 1957, and became one of classic cinema's most celebrated couples. Yet that beautiful ending can make people forget the uncomfortable beginning. Bacall and Bogart's famous partnership started while another marriage was still very much part of the picture. Number 9. Rita Hayworth and Howard Hughes. Beauty gave her unimaginable fame, but it rarely gave Rita Hayworth a peaceful private life. During her early Hollywood years, she endured a deeply unhappy first marriage to Edward Judson, a businessman who also managed her career. Around this turbulent period, billionaire Howard Hughes became one of the famous men repeatedly linked romantically to Hayworth. Biographical accounts describe Hughes among the relationships surrounding her complicated love life, although the details are less thoroughly documented than better-known affairs involving stars such as Taylor or Bergman. That distinction matters because Hayworth's private history has accumulated decades of exaggerated Hollywood storytelling. What is clear is that her first marriage was collapsing as her career accelerated. After divorcing Judson, Hayworth married Orson Welles, followed later by Prince Ali Khan and others. The contrast between image and reality became painful. On screen, Columbia sold Hayworth as an almost impossibly glamorous fantasy. Away from cameras, relationships frequently disappointed her. Her story reminds us that the headline may say, "secret affair," but behind those headlines were often unhappy marriages, loneliness, ambition, and stars whose real lives were far less glamorous than their photographs suggested. Number 10. Loretta Young and Clark Gable. For years, Hollywood maintained one extraordinary secret involving two enormous stars. During production of The Call of the Wild in 1935, Loretta Young became pregnant with Clark Gable's child. Gable was married to Maria Rhea Langham. Young disappeared from public view for part of the pregnancy, and later presented her daughter, Judy Lewis, as an adopted child. The truth remained officially hidden for decades, even though rumors circulated inside Hollywood. Near the end of her life, Young acknowledged that Gable was Judy's father. Her daughter had already written publicly about discovering her parentage. Later, Young's family introduced a deeply important complication, saying Young had eventually described the encounter with Gable as non-consensual. Because of that later account, it would be inaccurate to present their story simply as a glamorous, consensual, secret romance. What remains indisputable is that Hollywood concealed Judy Lewis's parentage for years, showing just how effectively the studio-era publicity machine could protect its most valuable stars. Number 11. Judy Garland and Joseph L. Mankiewicz. Behind Judy Garland's cheerful MGM musicals was a private life becoming increasingly difficult to control. During the early 1940s, while her marriage to musician David Rose was effectively breaking apart, Garland became involved with writer and producer Joseph L. Mankiewicz. The relationship developed during a period when Garland was moving from adolescent star to adult performer, yet MGM still exercised extraordinary control over almost every detail of her public image. Mankiewicz was considerably older and already an established Hollywood figure. Later accounts of Garland's life identify him as a significant relationship rather than a casual rumor. By the time Meet Me in St. Louis brought Garland together with director Vincente Minnelli, her relationship with Mankiewicz had ended and she was separated from Rose. That timing is important. Old Hollywood biographies often compress complicated separations, divorces, and romances into a single sensational sentence. Garland eventually divorced Rose and married Minnelli in 1945. That marriage produced her daughter Liza Minnelli, but also ended in divorce. For Garland, secretive relationships were only one part of a much larger struggle between the private woman and the relentlessly managed MGM star. Number 12. Gloria Swanson and Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. Power, money, movies, and politics collided when silent film superstar Gloria Swanson became involved with businessman Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. in the late 1920s. Kennedy was married to Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy and already the father of a growing family. Swanson, meanwhile, was still married to Henri de la Falaise. Their relationship went far beyond a passing Hollywood flirtation. Kennedy became deeply involved in Swanson's business affairs and film financing, particularly during the troubled production of Queen Kelly. Their personal relationship became enough of an open secret within Hollywood that later biographies treat the affair as established history. What made the story extraordinary was Kennedy's future family legacy. One of his sons, John F. Kennedy, would eventually become President of the United States, giving the affair an added layer of historical fascination. Professionally, however, the partnership ended badly. Queen Kelly became a costly disaster, financial arrangements between them grew complicated, and Kennedy ultimately withdrew from Hollywood. Swanson later rebuilt herself through other ventures and achieved an unforgettable comeback in Sunset Boulevard. Decades before that fictional Norma Desmond exposed Hollywood's cruelty, Swanson had already lived through a real story of ambition, secrecy, money, and a powerful married man who entered both her professional and private world. Number 13. Bette Davis and Gary Merrill. During production of All About Eve, Bette Davis found herself making one of the greatest films of her career, and beginning a relationship that quickly changed her personal life. At the time, Davis was married to artist William Grant Sherry. Gary Merrill, her co-star in the film, played her character's supportive boyfriend on screen. Away from the cameras, attraction reportedly developed between them. The timing was hardly subtle once events began moving. Davis divorced Sherry in 1950 and married Merrill later that same year. Their partnership initially seemed like one of Hollywood's rare cases where an affair might lead to lasting happiness. They adopted children, worked together again, and presented themselves as a formidable acting couple. But the marriage became increasingly troubled. Arguments, career tensions, and personal conflicts accumulated until they divorced in 1960. Davis later wrote and spoke with characteristic sharpness about her marriages, rarely pretending her personal life had resembled the elegant fantasies sold by Hollywood. The Merrill story is particularly fascinating because All About Eve is itself a film about ambition, loyalty, deception, and shifting relationships. Behind the scenes, Davis's own life was undergoing a transformation almost as dramatic as the screenplay. Number 14. Lana Turner and Tyrone Power. Few actresses better represented the dangerous glamour of old Hollywood than Lana Turner. In the late 1940s, that reputation became even more intense when she entered a relationship with Tyrone Power. Power was still legally married to French actress Annabella, although their marriage was badly strained and headed toward divorce. Turner later described Power as one of the important men in her life. According to biographical accounts, the relationship became serious enough for Turner to imagine marriage. But Hollywood romances rarely followed simple scripts. Power's marriage ended, yet he eventually married actress Linda Christian instead. Turner continued through a famously complicated series of marriages and relationships of her own. The story became part of the mythology surrounding an actress whose private life was watched almost as closely as her movies. But there is another reason Turner's case matters. Studio publicity often encouraged audiences to see glamorous stars as romantic fantasies, while simultaneously demanding that those performers maintain respectable private images. Turner was caught inside that contradiction more than almost anyone. Her relationship with Power happened during a period when one marriage was technically still active, creating exactly the sort of messy reality studios preferred to replace with carefully written magazine profiles and perfectly posed photographs. Number 15. Marlene Dietrich and her extraordinary open marriage. Almost every rule surrounding marriage seemed negotiable in Marlene Dietrich's private world. She married Rudolf Sieber in 1923, and although they separated romantically, they never legally divorced. Instead, the marriage developed into an unconventional arrangement, while Dietrich pursued numerous relationships during her decades as an international star. One of the most important was director Josef von Sternberg, whose films, including The Blue Angel, Morocco, and Shanghai Express, helped create the mysterious screen image that made Dietrich famous. Biographical accounts also connect her romantically with major actors, writers, and public figures. Unlike actresses forced to conceal every hint of unconventional behavior, Dietrich seems to have lived according to her own rules while maintaining a close, lifelong connection with Sieber. That makes calling these relationships simply secret affairs slightly misleading. They may have violated traditional ideas of marriage, but Dietrich and her husband understood their arrangement more clearly than outsiders did. Still, audiences who saw the elegant married star on screen rarely knew the complexity behind that image. Hollywood sold Dietrich as mysterious. In reality, her private life may have been even more unconventional than anything the studio publicity departments dared to print. Number 16. Grace Kelly and the Married Leading Men. No actress appeared more respectable than Grace Kelly. Beautiful, controlled, elegant, and eventually royal, she seemed almost designed to represent perfection. Her Hollywood biographies, however, have long described a far more complicated romantic life before she married Prince Rainier III of Monaco in 1956. Among the men linked to Kelly were married co-stars, including Ray Milland and William Holden. The exact details remain disputed, and many accounts rely on later biographies rather than contemporary confirmation from Kelly herself. That distinction is important. What is well established is that Kelly's polished image concealed a woman with an active and emotionally complicated private life. Vanity Fair, among other publications, has noted how later biographies challenged the almost saintly public portrait created around her. Once she became Princess Grace, every earlier relationship became even more fascinating to biographers. Yet this is one case where narration needs restraint. It would be easy to declare every rumored romance a proven affair simply because the story sounds dramatic. The safer conclusion is more interesting anyway. One of Hollywood's most controlled public images produced some of its most persistent private mysteries, and the full truth probably belonged only to the people involved. Number 17. Audrey Hepburn and Ben Gazzara. Even an actress celebrated for grace and restraint had a marriage complicated by infidelity. Audrey Hepburn married Italian psychiatrist Andrea Dotti in 1969, hoping for a quieter family life after the breakdown of her first marriage to actor Mel Ferrer. The stability she wanted did not last. Accounts of the marriage describe Dotti as repeatedly unfaithful. During production of the 1979 film Bloodline, Hepburn became involved with her co-star Ben Gazzara. Gazzara later spoke about the attraction between them, and biographical accounts describe the relationship as an affair. By that point, Hepburn's marriage was already deeply troubled. She and Dotti eventually divorced in 1982. Soon afterward, Hepburn built a lasting relationship with Dutch actor Robert Wolders, whom she later described as bringing her tremendous happiness. The Gazzara episode rarely dominates discussions of Hepburn because her humanitarian work, fashion influence, and films such as Roman Holiday and Breakfast at Tiffany's overshadow celebrity gossip. Yet it complicates the impossibly perfect image often attached to her. Hepburn's life was not a fairy tale. It included disappointment, marital loneliness, difficult choices, and moments when even one of Hollywood's most admired actresses searched outside an unhappy marriage for emotional connection. Number 18. Jennifer Jones and David O. Selznick. A young actress searching for opportunity walked into David O. Selznick's professional world and eventually changed both of their marriages. Jennifer Jones, then still using her birth name, Phyllis Isley, was married to actor Robert Walker when Selznick recognized her potential. He reshaped her screen identity, promoted her aggressively, and guided her toward the role in The Song of Bernadette that won her an Academy Award. During that rapid rise, Jones and Selznick began an affair. Jones separated from Walker in 1943 and divorced him in 1945. Selznick was himself married to Irene Mayer Selznick, daughter of MGM titan Louise B. Mayer. Their affair therefore involved not merely two private marriages, but several of Hollywood's most powerful professional families. Selznick eventually divorced Irene and married Jones in 1949. Their relationship lasted until his death in 1965, which means the story cannot simply be reduced to a temporary studio romance. He shaped her career, controlled many of her projects, and remained central to both her professional success and personal life. For Robert Walker, however, the breakup was deeply painful. Behind Jones's saintly breakthrough performance existed a situation filled with ambition, heartbreak, marriage, influence, and one of Hollywood's most powerful producers falling for the actress whose career he was carefully constructing. Number 19. Dolores Del Rio and Orson Welles. Before Orson Welles became permanently identified with Citizen Kane, he was already falling for one of the most glamorous actresses in Hollywood. Dolores Del Rio, the celebrated Mexican star, was married to MGM art director Cedric Gibbons when she became involved with Welles around 1940. Their relationship quickly became serious. Welles accompanied her publicly, traveled with her, and reportedly considered her one of the great loves of his early life. The timing, however, created obvious difficulties because Del Rio's marriage had not yet ended. The American Film Institute and later biographical accounts described their romance as an affair that contributed to the collapse of her marriage to Gibbons. After the divorce, Del Rio and Welles continued together for a period. She appeared in Journey into Fear, a project closely connected with Welles's filmmaking circle. But their relationship eventually deteriorated as Welles's life and career grew increasingly chaotic. Del Rio returned to Mexico and entered another extraordinary stage of her career, becoming a central figure in Mexican cinema's golden age. Long before international stars routinely moved between industries, she had already conquered Hollywood. Her relationship with Wells added another dramatic chapter, one that began quietly while one of Hollywood's most stylish marriages was still legally intact. Number 20. Mary Astor and George S. Kaufman. If any old Hollywood scandal sounds as though a screenwriter invented it, Mary Astor's diary controversy is that story. Astor was married to physician Franklin Thorpe when she had an affair with playwright and director George S. Kaufman, himself married at the time. The relationship might have remained private had Astor's marriage not collapsed into an ugly custody battle. Thorpe possessed Astor's personal diary and attempted to use passages from it against her. Newspapers became obsessed with what the diary supposedly contained, transforming a family court dispute into national entertainment. One name attracted particular attention: George S. Kaufman. Astor faced humiliating publicity at exactly the moment her career should have been the focus. Remarkably, she continued working, appearing in Dodsworth during the controversy, and later winning an Academy Award for The Great Lie. The diary itself became almost mythical, with sensational versions circulating for decades. Historians have since shown that some legendary quotations attributed to it were distorted or invented. The affair, however, was real enough to become central to the custody case. Astor ultimately retained custody of her daughter, survived the scandal, and continued acting, an impressive outcome during an era when actresses were often expected to pay far more heavily than men for exactly this sort of behavior. Number 21. Dorothy Dandridge and Otto Preminger. A career-changing professional partnership gradually became something much more personal when Dorothy Dandridge worked with director Otto Preminger. Preminger directed her in Carmen Jones, the 1954 musical that turned Dandridge into the first black woman nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. Behind the extraordinary professional breakthrough, however, they were also having an affair. Dandridge was divorced at the time, but Preminger was still married. According to accounts preserved by the American Film Institute, their relationship lasted several years. Preminger exercised enormous influence over Dandridge's career decisions, reportedly advising her against certain roles. That has led biographers to examine whether the relationship helped her professionally, limited her opportunities, or did both at different times. Eventually, the affair ended. Dandridge's career afterward never reached the heights many believed her talent deserved, although racism within the film industry, not simply her private relationships, created enormous barriers. Her story therefore deserves more than scandalous framing. What makes the Preminger affair historically interesting is the imbalance surrounding it. A groundbreaking black actress, a powerful married director, a Hollywood system offering her painfully few good roles, and a private relationship tangled tightly with the professional decisions that could determine whether she remained a star. Number 22. Patricia Neal and Gary Cooper. A film called The Fountainhead brought Patricia Neal face-to-face with Gary Cooper in 1949, and their off-screen relationship soon became far more complicated than the movie. Neal was young and unmarried. Cooper, however, had been married to socialite Veronica "Rocky" Balfe since 1933 and was one of Hollywood's most established stars. Their affair lasted for several years. According to Neal's later accounts, she fell deeply in love with Cooper and hoped he might eventually leave his marriage. The relationship became increasingly painful as secrecy, public curiosity, and Cooper's family responsibilities collided. Cooper temporarily separated from his wife, but he never built a permanent life with Neal. Eventually, the affair ended, and he reconciled with Rocky. Neal later married writer Roald Dahl and built a remarkable career that included an Academy Award for HUD and an extraordinary return to acting after serious health problems. Yet she remained unusually candid about Cooper. That openness is one reason this affair is much better documented than many old Hollywood stories. It was not invented decades later by anonymous gossip. Neal herself discussed the emotional consequences, allowing audiences to see something studio publicity usually erased. What happened after the glamorous secret relationship ended, and the less powerful person was left dealing with its consequences. Number 23. Gene Tierney and John F. Kennedy. Long before John F. Kennedy entered the White House, his romantic life had already crossed paths with Hollywood. During the late 1940s, Gene Tierney, star of Laura and one of the era's most striking actresses, became romantically involved with Kennedy, while her marriage to fashion designer Oleg Cassini was deteriorating. Accounts differ slightly over exactly where the marriage stood emotionally when the relationship began. Tierney and Cassini experienced repeated separations and reconciliation attempts, making a neat description difficult. What is clear from biographical sources, including the British Film Institute, is that Tierney and Kennedy had a serious relationship. Tierney reportedly considered the possibility of a future with him. Kennedy, however, had political ambitions and family expectations that made marriage to a divorced Hollywood actress complicated. Their relationship ended. Tierney eventually attempted to repair her marriage with Cassini, although they ultimately divorced. Years later, Kennedy became president, turning every earlier romance into irresistible material for historians and biographers. Yet Tierney's story is more than presidential gossip. During an era when actresses were expected to preserve almost impossible public standards, her private life contained separation, reconciliation, emotional uncertainty, and relationships that did not fit neatly inside the studio-approved image of the perfect movie star wife. Number 24. Linda Darnell and Joseph L. Mankiewicz. One of Hollywood's most beautiful stars spent years involved with a powerful filmmaker who had no intention of leaving his marriage. Linda Darnell began a relationship with writer-director Joseph L. Mankiewicz around the time they worked together on A Letter to Three Wives and No Way Out. Darnell herself was married to cameraman Peverell Marley. The affair lasted for years and became emotionally important to her. According to biographical accounts, Darnell eventually hoped Mankiewicz would divorce his wife and build a permanent future with her. He would not. That refusal helped bring the relationship to an end and reportedly left Darnell devastated. The professional context made everything more complicated. Mankiewicz directed Darnell in some of her strongest work, meaning romance, ambition, creative respect, and career opportunity became intertwined. Darnell's later life never matched the fairy tale image audiences might have imagined for someone famous for extraordinary beauty. Her marriages failed, her career declined, and she died tragically young after suffering severe injuries in a house fire. The Mankiewicz affair therefore feels less like glamorous Hollywood gossip and more like another example of a star discovering that beauty and fame offered remarkably little protection from disappointment. Sometimes, the most dangerous Hollywood secret was simply believing the other person would eventually choose you. Number 25. Carole Lombard and Clark Gable. Hollywood loved eventually presenting Clark Gable and Carole Lombard as a perfect match, but their famous romance began before Gable was legally free. The two had worked together earlier without falling in love. Everything changed after they reconnected socially in 1936. By then, Lombard was divorced from William Powell, while Gable remained married to his second wife, Maria Rhea Langham. Their attraction became increasingly serious, and Hollywood knew it. Vanity Fair's account of the relationship notes directly that Gable was still married while falling in love with Lombard. His wife resisted an immediate divorce, and the situation stretched on for years. Only after Gable finally reached a settlement and obtained his divorce in March 1939 could the couple marry. They wed later that month. Their marriage became famous for humor, affection, and the comparatively simple life they built on an Encino ranch. That happiness ended catastrophically when Lombard died in a plane crash in January 1942 while returning from a war bond trip. Gable was devastated. Because their marriage ended so tragically, later retellings often transform the entire relationship into pure romance. But the beginning was messier. Hollywood's beloved Ma and Pa had first become a couple while another woman was still Mrs. Clark Gable. Number 26. Ida Lupino and Howard Duff. A complicated marriage was already nearing its end when Ida Lupino began a relationship with actor Howard Duff. Lupino had married producer Collier Young in 1948. Their personal partnership did not last, although professionally they remained unusually cooperative and even continued working together after separating. During that transition, Lupino became involved with Duff. Biographical accounts state that when she filed for divorce from Young in 1951, she was already expecting a child with Duff. Once the divorce became final, Lupino and Duff married almost immediately. The relationship then lasted far longer than many Hollywood romances that had begun under complicated circumstances. They remained married for nearly 2 decades before separating and eventually divorcing. Lupino's story is particularly interesting because her career itself defied expectations. She was not simply an actress. She became one of the very few women directing American films during the 1950s, tackling difficult subjects that mainstream studios often avoided. Later, she became a prolific television director. Compared with the sensational publicity surrounding actresses such as Taylor or Bergman, Lupino's private transition from one relationship to another generated less lasting outrage. Perhaps that was partly because she never allowed scandal to define her identity. The far more remarkable secret about Ida Lupino was how quietly she built authority behind the camera in an industry overwhelmingly controlled by men. Number 27. Merle Oberon and Richard Hillary. Wartime Britain gave Merle Oberon one of the most dramatic relationships of her already carefully guarded private life. The actress was married to filmmaker Alexander Korda when she became involved with Royal Air Force pilot and writer Richard Hillary. Hillary had become famous after surviving devastating injuries during the Battle of Britain and writing the acclaimed memoir The Last Enemy. According to biographies of Oberon, the two developed a relationship while her marriage to Korda still existed. The affair was emotionally significant, but it could never develop into a conventional future. Hillary returned to flying despite concerns about his health and was killed in a training accident in 1943. Oberon remained a major star whose personal history contained secrets extending far beyond romance. For much of her life, she obscured details of her mixed-race heritage because the prejudices of the film industry threatened her career. Stories were constructed about her birthplace and background to maintain a marketable Hollywood identity. Against that larger history, the Hillary relationship reveals how carefully Oberon separated public image from private reality. To audiences, she was elegant, exotic, and distant. Behind the image stood complicated marriages, hidden origins, wartime loss, and a relationship with a famous young pilot whose life ended before either of them could know what might have happened next. Number 28. Zsa Zsa Gabor and Porfirio Rubirosa. Scandal almost seemed to follow Zsa Zsa Gabor naturally, and one of her most famous early relationships involved Dominican diplomat and international playboy Porfirio Rubirosa. Gabor was married to actor George Sanders when she became involved with Rubirosa. Vanity Fair's history of Rubirosa describes the affair openly and notes how seriously it affected her marriage. Rubirosa had a reputation for relationships with wealthy and glamorous women around the world. Gabor, already famous for beauty, wit, and an unconventional attitude toward romance, was exactly the sort of personality newspapers loved linking to him. Eventually, Sanders filed for divorce. Gabor's relationship with Rubirosa did not become a stable marriage either. He moved through a remarkable series of relationships, while she would eventually marry 9 times. It is tempting to treat Gabor's private life as comedy because she herself often joked about marriage. But beneath the clever one-liners was a woman who understood celebrity astonishingly well. Long before reality television, she realized personality itself could become a career. The Rubirosa affair helped build that public mythology, but unlike many stories attached to her name, this one is supported by serious biographical reporting rather than simply tabloid invention. For Gabor, scandal was not necessarily the end of a career. Sometimes, scandal became part of the brand. Number 29. Paulette Goddard and Diego Rivera. Parisian glamour, Mexican art, Charlie Chaplin, and Diego Rivera all somehow intersected in Paulette Goddard's complicated private life. Goddard was associated with, and later publicly described as married to, Charlie Chaplin during the 1930s and early 1940s. During that period, she became close to celebrated Mexican painter Diego Rivera. Christie's, discussing Rivera's portrait of Goddard, notes the romantic relationship between them while she was connected by marriage to Chaplin. Rivera was himself famous for complicated relationships, most notably his turbulent marriage to painter Frida Kahlo. Goddard's connection with Rivera therefore brought together several of the 20th century's most recognizable cultural figures. The relationship did not turn into marriage. Goddard and Chaplin eventually separated, and she later married actor Burgess Meredith and writer Eric Maria Remarque. Her career, meanwhile, continued through films such as Modern Times, The Great Dictator, and So Proudly We Hail. What makes the Rivera episode so fascinating is how international Goddard's world had become. She moved easily among filmmakers, artists, intellectuals, and wealthy social circles. The usual Hollywood image of a secret romance occurring behind a locked studio bungalow feels almost too small here. This was a relationship taking place across artistic worlds and involving partners whose existing commitments made the situation considerably more complicated than any publicity photograph suggested. Number 30. Joan Bennett and Jennings Lang. One of old Hollywood's most sensational relationship scandals eventually involved a parking lot, a powerful producer, and an accusation that became front-page news. Joan Bennett was married to producer Walter Wanger when she became extremely close to agent Jennings Lang. Wanger suspected the relationship was romantic. Bennett initially denied that she and Lang were lovers, which is important when discussing the story responsibly. Later accounts, however, have often described their relationship as an affair. In December 1951, Wanger confronted Lang and shot him. Lang survived, while Wanger later served a short jail sentence. The entire affair created devastating publicity for Bennett. Although she had enjoyed a long career and had become especially respected for films made with director Fritz Lang, the scandal damaged her position in Hollywood. She found far fewer major movie roles afterward and increasingly turned towards stage and television work. What makes Bennett's story different from the glamorous romances elsewhere on this list is how quickly private suspicion became a public crisis. There was no elegant divorce followed by a magazine wedding spread. Instead, a troubled marriage exploded into a criminal case and transformed Bennett's career. Whether every accusation Wanger made was accurate remained disputed, but the consequences were unquestionably real, and Bennett paid a professional price for a scandal built largely around what men believed she had been doing privately. Number 31. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks. Two of silent cinema's greatest stars once had to hide the romance that would later make them America's unofficial movie royalty. Mary Pickford was married to actor Owen Moore when she and Douglas Fairbanks became romantically involved. Fairbanks also had a marriage and family of his own. Their relationship developed while both were enormous public figures, creating a dangerous problem. Pickford's wholesome America's sweetheart image was extraordinarily valuable, and a scandal involving adultery could have damaged both careers. So the romance remained discreet while divorces were arranged. Pickford divorced Moore in March 1920. Soon afterward, she married Fairbanks, and the couple became a cultural phenomenon. Their Beverly Hills mansion, Pickfair, turned into one of Hollywood's most famous social centers, hosting royalty, politicians, artists, and fellow movie stars. For years, they looked like the perfect Hollywood couple. Eventually, however, Fairbanks became involved with another woman, and their marriage collapsed. Pickford divorced him in 1936. The irony is hard to miss. A relationship that began secretly because two existing marriages stood in the way eventually became perhaps Hollywood's most celebrated marriage, only to end under circumstances strangely similar to the way it started. Long before Taylor and Burton, Pickford and Fairbanks demonstrated that the movie industry's greatest romances often looked much simpler from the theater seats than they did inside the homes of the people involved. Number 32. Marion Davies and William Randolph Hearst. Everyone in Hollywood seemed to know, yet officially the situation remained carefully controlled. Marion Davies spent decades as the partner of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. The complication was obvious. Hearst remained married to Millicent Hearst. His wife would not grant him the divorce that might have allowed him to marry Davies. The result was one of the longest and most famous unconventional relationships in American entertainment history. Hearst financed Davies's films, promoted her through his newspapers, and built an extravagant social world around her. San Simeon, his enormous California estate, became a gathering place for Hollywood stars and political figures. The relationship also complicated Davies's reputation as an actress. Because Hearst pushed her career so aggressively, critics often assumed she possessed little talent and owed everything to him. Later reassessment has been kinder, particularly toward her ability as a comic performer. Their romance lasted until Hearst's death in 1951. Davies reportedly remained devoted to him, and their connection survived far longer than many legally recognized Hollywood marriages. That longevity makes the phrase "secret affair" almost absurd. The relationship was widely understood, but social convention demanded an official fiction. Hearst had a wife. Davies had no legal claim to being his spouse. Yet for decades, she was the woman sharing much of his private life, a reality Hollywood knew even when polite society avoided stating it directly. Number 33. Louise Brooks and Charlie Chaplin. Years before Louise Brooks became the eternal face of silent film rebellion, she experienced a brief affair with the most famous comedian in the world. Brooks later wrote openly about spending roughly 2 months with Charlie Chaplin during the summer of 1925. At the time, Chaplin was married to Lita Grey. Unlike many old Hollywood stories reconstructed from anonymous gossip, decades later, this relationship has an unusually direct source: Brooks herself. She never seemed particularly interested in protecting Hollywood mythology. Her later writing was sharp, unsentimental, and often devastating about the people she knew. The Chaplin affair took place before Brooks reached the height of her film fame. She was young, independent, and already moving through the sophisticated entertainment circles surrounding Broadway and Hollywood. Chaplin, meanwhile, was one of the world's most recognizable human beings. Their relationship ended without becoming a permanent partnership. Brooks went on to achieve immortality through films such as Pandora's Box, only to walk away from Hollywood's studio machinery and eventually spend years in obscurity before critics rediscovered her work. Her story feels strangely modern. She refused to behave like a carefully managed star, refused to pretend every relationship had been noble, and later described the contradictions of Hollywood with unusual honesty. In an industry built on concealment, Louise Brooks became most dangerous when she started telling her own stories. Number 34. Greta Garbo and Mercedes D'Acosta. Few Hollywood stars protected privacy more successfully than Greta Garbo, which is why every claimed relationship involving her has generated decades of debate. One of the most discussed involves writer Mercedes D'Acosta. D'Acosta moved through artistic circles filled with famous women and was married to painter Abram Poole when she became close to Garbo. Later biographers, including Lois Banner, have interpreted surviving correspondence and D'Acosta's papers as evidence of a romantic relationship between the two women. Others have argued that D'Acosta exaggerated aspects of her celebrity relationships. That disagreement must remain part of the story. What is beyond dispute is that Garbo and D'Acosta had an intensely personal connection and exchanged correspondence over many years. Garbo guarded her private life fiercely and never offered the public a convenient explanation. For MGM, mystery increased her appeal. Garbo talks, and later, Garbo laughs, became advertising events, while the real woman behind the screen remained inaccessible. That silence helped protect her, but also allowed later generations to fill the gaps with speculation. So this entry is not a declaration that every sensational claim about Garbo is proven. Instead, it represents one of old Hollywood's most compelling unresolved relationships. A famously private actress, a married writer who loved famous women, and letters that continue to invite interpretation long after both were gone. Number 35. Deborah Kerr and Stuart Granger. Some affairs enter Hollywood history because both people confirm them. Others survive because one participant tells the story and the other responds with a raised eyebrow. Deborah Kerr's alleged relationship with Stuart Granger belongs to the second category. In his autobiography, Granger claimed he and Kerr had an affair in 1945 while he was married to actress Elspeth March. Kerr later responded to his account with dry humor rather than providing a straightforward confirmation. That means this story should be treated as Granger's claim, not an unquestionable historical fact. The two knew each other early in Kerr's British career, before she became an international star through films such as From Here to Eternity, The King and I, and An Affair to Remember. Ironically, Kerr later became associated with some of cinema's most famous stories about forbidden love. Her public image remained sophisticated and controlled, making Granger's revelation especially irresistible to biographers. Yet the uncertainty itself tells us something about old Hollywood. Memoirs were often published decades after alleged relationships, when one participant might already be dead or unwilling to argue publicly. Once printed, a claim could become repeated until people forgot who had originally made it. So in Kerr's case, the dramatic headline is simple, but the responsible version is more complicated. Stuart Granger said it happened, while Deborah Kerr never gave historians the neat confirmation they might have wanted. Number 36. Maureen O'Hara and the Anthony Quinn claim. Another legendary actress spent years rejecting a story that someone else insisted was true. Anthony Quinn claimed that he and Maureen O'Hara had been romantically involved while working together on Sinbad the Sailor. O'Hara denied the affair. That denial matters enough to be stated immediately because repeating Quinn's version as proven fact would misrepresent the historical record. O'Hara cultivated a reputation for fierce independence and later spoke frankly about Hollywood, directors, co-stars, and powerful men. She was not known for quietly accepting stories she considered false. Quinn, meanwhile, had a famously complicated romantic history and wrote about relationships with numerous women. Their competing versions illustrate one of the biggest problems when researching Golden Age Hollywood. Memory is not evidence merely because a famous person wrote it in a memoir. One participant may remember a relationship as passionate, the other may describe nothing of the sort. Studios also planted fake romances when useful, while gossip columnists exaggerated genuine friendships. O'Hara eventually became famous not only for movies such as How Green Was My Valley and The Quiet Man, but also for her forceful personality. So perhaps the most accurate ending to this particular Hollywood secret is exactly what O'Hara would have demanded. Anthony Quinn made the claim, Maureen O'Hara denied it, and viewers should not erase her denial simply because the scandalous version makes a better headline. Number 37. Joanne Woodward and Paul Newman. Hollywood later celebrated Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward as one of its great enduring marriages. But even this famous partnership had a complicated beginning. When Newman met Woodward during the Broadway production of Picnic in 1953, he was already married to Jackie Whitty and had children. Attraction developed between Newman and Woodward, although their relationship evolved over several years. Newman's own posthumously published memoir material acknowledges that the romance began before his first marriage had ended. By the time Newman and Woodward made the long hot summer together, their connection had become impossible to ignore. Newman divorced Whitty in early 1958 and married Woodward shortly afterward. The second marriage lasted 50 years until Newman's death in 2008. That remarkable longevity encouraged a simplified Hollywood legend. Handsome actor meets brilliant actress, they marry, and unlike everyone else in Hollywood, they stay together forever. Reality was more complicated. Their partnership endured professional competition, family difficulties, Newman's drinking, and his own acknowledged shortcomings. Woodward built an extraordinary acting career herself, winning an Academy Award for The Three Faces of Eve. Their story therefore should neither be romanticized beyond recognition nor reduced to scandal. It began painfully for Newman's first family, but eventually became a genuine lifelong partnership, proof that some Hollywood relationships could emerge from morally complicated beginnings without remaining temporary affairs. Number 38. Tallulah Bankhead and a marriage with few rules. Conventional marriage was never likely to fit Tallulah Bankhead particularly well. The outspoken actress married actor John Emery in 1937, but their relationship rapidly became unconventional. Biographical accounts describe both partners becoming involved in extramarital relationships as the marriage deteriorated. That fact is more solid than many individual names later attached romantically to Bankhead. Over the decades, she has been linked to an extraordinary range of famous men and women, but some stories remain impossible to verify. Bankhead herself encouraged the mythology. She was witty, provocative, politically outspoken, and completely uninterested in behaving like the carefully controlled female stars' studio publicity departments preferred. Her marriage to Emery ended in divorce in 1941. Afterward, she never married again. Unlike actresses whose reputations were damaged by a single affair, Bankhead's public personality was already so rebellious that scandal almost strengthened her legend. She had built an identity around refusing conventional expectations. That does not mean every outrageous story attributed to her should be believed. In fact, separating Bankhead, the real person, from Tallulah, the larger-than-life character, is nearly impossible. What can be said with confidence is that her marriage became non-exclusive before it ended, and both spouses sought relationships elsewhere. For a woman living under Hollywood's strict moral codes, simply refusing to pretend otherwise was radical enough. Number 39. Alla Nazimova and Mercedes de Acosta. Long before Hollywood openly discussed same-sex relationships, actress Alla Nazimova lived a private life that challenged nearly every respectable convention of the period. The Russian-born stage and screen star was legally married to actor Sergei Golovin, although they lived separate lives. Later, Nazimova publicly presented actor Charles Bryant as her husband, despite the fact that their supposed marriage was not legally valid. During this complicated arrangement, she became romantically involved with writer Mercedes de Acosta around 1916. The American Film Institute's biographical material on Nazimova discusses both the legal husband she had left behind and her relationship with de Acosta. Nazimova later became associated with a circle of women in Hollywood whose relationships were rarely discussed openly. Her lavish home on Sunset Boulevard, known as the Garden of Allah after it became a hotel, eventually became legendary as a gathering place for artists, actors, and writers. By modern standards, the secrecy surrounding Nazimova's relationships can seem strange, but early 20th century performers faced enormous professional and social risks if private lives departed too visibly from accepted norms. Nazimova therefore maintained layers of public fiction: a legal marriage that functionally meant little, another marriage that was not legal, and meaningful relationships that Hollywood could barely acknowledge. Few careers reveal more clearly how far the public story could differ from the truth behind the gates. Number 40. Evelyn Keyes and Charles Vidor. Separation did not always mean legal freedom, especially in an era when divorce could take time. Evelyn Keyes was still legally married to Barton Bainbridge when their relationship fell apart in 1940. During that period, she began an affair with director Charles Vidor. Historical accounts describe Keyes and Bainbridge as separated when the relationship with Vidor began, an important detail that makes the situation less sensational than simply saying a married actress secretly betrayed her husband. Bainbridge died before their divorce could be completed. Keyes later married Vidor, although that marriage also eventually ended. Her romantic history remained colorful. She later married director John Huston and bandleader Artie Shaw, becoming connected with several of Hollywood's most charismatic and difficult men. Yet Keyes never became as mythologized as actresses such as Ava Gardner or Elizabeth Taylor. Today she is still best remembered by many viewers as Sue Ellen O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. Her private story was considerably richer than that supporting role suggests. The Vidor relationship demonstrates why dates matter in Hollywood history. Legal documents may describe someone as married, while emotionally the relationship has already ended. A headline can turn that technical overlap into scandal, but the reality may involve separation, grief, and a new relationship beginning before the paperwork catches up. Old Hollywood loved simple morality tales. Real marriages were rarely that simple. Number 41. Myrna Loy and Arthur Hornblow Jr. Few actresses projected intelligence and marital sophistication more convincingly than Myrna Loy, especially after The Thin Man transformed her and William Powell into cinema's favorite fictional married couple. Her real romantic life, however, contained complications of its own. During the early 1930s, Loy began seeing producer Arthur Hornblow Jr. Hornblow was still legally married at the time. Their relationship continued until he was free to marry Loy, which they eventually did in 1936. For modern audiences, familiar primarily with Loy's witty, civilized screen persona, the situation may seem surprisingly messy. But Hollywood's social world was filled with long separations, delayed divorces, and relationships beginning before previous marriages had legally ended. Loy's marriage to Hornblow lasted until 1942. She later married 3 more times, though none of her marriages lasted permanently. Unlike many actresses whose romantic lives became defining tabloid material, Loy retained an unusually dignified public image. Part of that came from her personality, but part came from the roles she played. Audiences wanted to believe Nora Charles's effortless sophistication reflected the woman herself. Loy eventually became equally notable for political and humanitarian work, away from filmmaking. The Hornblow relationship is therefore a small but revealing contradiction. Even Hollywood's ultimate screenwife had once fallen for a man whose actual marriage had not yet reached its legal ending. Number 42. Olivia de Havilland and John Huston. Behind the elegance of Olivia de Havilland existed a romantic streak strong enough to pull her into an impossible relationship. While making In This Our Life in the early 1940s, de Havilland fell deeply for director John Huston. There was one obvious obstacle. Huston was married to Leslie Black. Vanity Fair later described de Havilland's feelings for Huston as an impossible love, specifically because he remained locked in that marriage. Other biographical sources likewise identify their relationship as romantic. De Havilland reportedly hoped to marry him. It never happened. Huston joined the military during World War II and continued living the notoriously restless personal life that would eventually include several marriages. De Havilland moved forward too, later marrying novelist Marcus Goodrich and eventually journalist Pierre Galante. Professionally, she was entering one of the most important battles of her life. Her lawsuit against Warner Brothers helped break the studio's ability to extend performers' contracts indefinitely through suspension periods. The resulting de Havilland Law became a major landmark in Hollywood labor history. That makes the contrast fascinating. At the same moment she was emotionally entangled with a married director, de Havilland was also becoming one of the strongest actresses in Hollywood when confronting studio power. Her heart may have led her toward an unavailable man, but professionally, she refused to remain trapped by anybody's rules. Number 43. Mae West and the marriage nobody was supposed to know about. For decades, Mae West's unmarried image helped support her famous jokes about romance. There was just one problem. She had secretly married vaudeville performer Frank Wallace back in 1911. The couple separated quickly, but remained legally married for more than 30 years. West initially denied the marriage when records surfaced publicly during the 1930s, before eventually acknowledging it. During those decades apart, she had other relationships, including a long partnership with manager James Timoney, beginning around 1916. Technically, therefore, West was still a married woman while pursuing a completely separate personal life. Calling these relationships conventional affairs would be misleading, because West and Wallace had stopped functioning as husband and wife almost immediately. But legally, the marriage remained. PBS's American Masters timeline records the secret wedding and rapid separation, while contemporary reporting later turned the rediscovered marriage certificate into news. West finally obtained a divorce during the early 1940s. The entire situation feels perfectly suited to her rebellious persona. Hollywood censors spent years worrying about Mae West's dialogue, while the real woman had already quietly ignored one of society's central conventions. Her case also demonstrates why legal marriage and actual partnership are not always the same thing. On paper, she had a husband. In everyday reality, she had been living independently for decades and apparently saw little reason why an old certificate should decide the rest of her life. Number 44. Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy. Few old Hollywood relationships generate more argument among fans and historians than the one allegedly shared by Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy. Their chemistry was undeniable. Together, they made 8 films and became one of cinema's most beloved musical pairings. A surviving 1935 letter from Eddy to MacDonald expresses deep devotion, and biographer Sharon Rich has argued extensively that their relationship continued romantically after both entered other marriages. MacDonald married actor Gene Raymond in 1937. Eddy married Anne Franklin in 1939. According to Rich's interpretation of letters, diaries, interviews, and family material, MacDonald and Eddy maintained an intermittent relationship for years. Other historians have challenged some of the more dramatic claims surrounding the story, and both stars publicly resisted the idea that their partnership resembled the grand secret romance later described by devoted researchers. So caution is essential. The surviving evidence supports an unusually intense personal bond, but not every sensational detail repeated online should automatically be accepted. What makes the story endure is how perfectly their films encouraged audiences to believe they belonged together. Every duet seemed to ask the same question: were viewers watching brilliant acting or something emotionally real? Decades later, the answer remains contested. The responsible conclusion is not that the legend has been fully proven, but that there was enough private attachment behind the famous screen partnership to keep the mystery alive long after the final song ended. Number 45. Anne Sheridan and Rodolfo Acosta. A romance late in Anne Sheridan's film career became serious enough to create legal trouble in Mexico. Sheridan had already experienced 2 failed marriages when she began a relationship with Mexican actor Rodolfo Acosta, her co-star in the 1953 adventure film Appointment in Honduras. Sheridan was unmarried. Acosta was not. The relationship continued for several years, and accounts state that the pair shared an apartment in Mexico City. Eventually, Acosta's wife, Janine Cohen Acosta, took action. In 1956, Sheridan was named in an adultery complaint in Mexico, and reports even described an arrest warrant being issued. The legal matter ultimately went nowhere, but the publicity made the supposedly private relationship considerably less private. Sheridan and Acosta eventually separated. She later married actor Scott McKay shortly before her death in 1967. The story feels like an appropriate final entry because Sheridan's career had begun under the carefully controlled Warner Bros. Studio system, which famously marketed her as the oomph girl. By the 1950s, however, the old machinery that once hid stars' private lives was weakening. A relationship involving a married co-star could now jump from film set to courtroom report. The age of Hollywood secrecy was beginning to fade, and the gap between carefully manufactured screen images and messy real lives was becoming harder for studios to control. So which of these old Hollywood stories surprised you most? Behind the perfect gowns, glamorous premieres, and carefully arranged photographs were relationships far more complicated than the studios wanted audiences to know. Some became legendary marriages, others ended painfully, and a few remain disputed even today. Tell us which actress deserves a deeper story in the comments, and if you enjoyed uncovering Hollywood's hidden history, like the video and subscribe for more.